So welcome to today's session. We're going to be talking about important considerations when you're applying for a position with a company. Tracy, start us off on this conversation this afternoon.
Thanks, Anel. Always good to chat to you. So, specifically looking at it from a candidate's perspective, there are things that we can easily forget to consider, and it's the stage of an organization in terms of their development. And when I talk about stage, I also talk about age, but also the size of the organization, because those do impact on jobs. And I think it's something that candidates can easily forget to ask about, especially at interview stage.
Tracy, you're talking about those stages. If I'm a candidate, what kind of stages am I looking out for?
Good question, Anil. I think one of the most critical ones is, are they like a startup where that's early phases, where they're relatively small, they're quite dynamic, they're still finding their feet, things are happening very quickly. That's one to consider. Another one could be, a company that's going through geographical expansion and suddenly there's remote teams all over the world, or even cost cutting. Bizarrely, people could be hiring during cost cutting exercises, especially bigger companies. So it's just mindful to think about and understand where they are in their life cycle.
Now, Tracy, you talked about startup phase. What would be the opposite of startup phase?
Opposite, I suppose, and now the opposite of the startup phase would be companies that are pretty big, very stable. They've been in business for a number of years. They're a household name. They would have huge departments. Each department would be segmented. They'd probably be very process and policy heavy, very different to a startup, which would be just starting out all of those things.
So Tracy, if I'm a candidate and I'm looking at the stage that this company is in, what kind of personalities do well in startup? How would I know if I would be a good fit for startup?
Such a good question and such a big topic, Anil. Honestly, I think it's about your appetite for uncertainty and potentially even risk. With smaller companies, you could be more exposed to senior management. You could be asked to do a lot of things that aren't necessarily on your job description. So flexibility. And when I talk about risk, companies that are startups are often trying new innovative things. And they could be paving the way. So I think an element of being okay with ambiguity, job descriptions may or may not have been created, or they may evolve quickly, So I think if you're open to change, that would be a good place for you.
Fantastic. So what I'm hearing from you, somebody with very high flexibility, somebody who is able to get stuck in, no matter whether it's on the job description or not, because that job description may not even exist.
Yeah.
So chief cook and bottle washer kind of situation. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, your more established companies, what kind of person does better in that kind of environment?
I suppose now people who are comfortable with process, stability, clarity. I mean, I say these things, even the most stable organizations can have, challenges, but usually they would have had a lot more effort and time put into their different processes and policies. So somebody who wants to know exactly what their job is, exactly what needs to be done, how they're going to be appraised, where their career trajectory, heads, all those different type of things. Somebody who wants more certainty and stability.
No, Tracy, I think, one of the important things is, having worked in startup phase and for a very large traditional company, I realized very quickly that you have a personal preference. Just because it's a Fortune 500 and it's listed doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good fit for you. How important do you think your personal preference is when you look at that placement in regards to these two different cultures, these two different environments you might find yourself in?
It's absolutely critical. You need to be aware of what your preference is and where
Mm.
you operate best. Um, and don't make assumptions, think about departments within big organizations that deal with innovation. It depends on the job, but knowing your preferences and where and how you work best is one of the most critical things. And talking about this, it's important to talk about and understand what the company is thinking of doing and where they are, so that you can match it to yourself.
And I think, Tracy, you make an incredibly important point. Asking these questions in that early engagement, in that interview, can save you a lot of headaches down the line. Because let's say I'm not very able to deal with risk. I don't like uncertainty. So I end up in a startup company, and 6 months down the line, I'm looking for a new job because it's not a good fit. I do think you make such a good and important point that these conversations should be had up front, and you should have the self-awareness to know which one of those scenarios would be a better fit for you personally.
And do your research, absolutely. And remember that, we've talked about it, both ends of the scale, the startup
Mm.
versus the 100-year-old company that's been in business forever. There's lots of variables in between and variations in between, where companies grow, scale back. Do your research, ask the questions, and make sure that you've got that fit. It really matters.
100%. Thank you very much, Tracy. What an interesting conversation.